Chapter 15. Eiji had been afraid that Lord Julia would be angry after being called away in the middle of the night, when most of the gods were busy and socializing with each other. Instead, she seemed dryly amused by the whole situation. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said as she prodded Eiji's shoulders with cold, careful fingers. "I've been called to repair Felix's attendant after a ferocious beating. How he must have battered you, poor fellow." "I did not!" Lord Felix, standing just barely far enough away to avoid hovering, sounded the furthest thing from amused. "Don't even joke about that, Julia!" "It's a joke because I knew you wouldn't," the god replied. "How did this happen?" Eiji faltered through his explanation, blushing at his own foolishness, but Lord Julia's expression didn't change. She just hummed her understanding, peered once more at his shoulder, and pulled back. "It appears to just be some bruising," she told him. "If you stop being able to move it, you have difficulty moving your elbow or fingers, you develop a lump, or the pain gets worse instead of better after a few days, fetch me right away." "Yes, my lord." "I'm going to wrap it. Felix, you're in charge of the wrappings after this time, assuming you remember how?" Lord Felix nodded. "I do. Thank you, Julia." "I'll give you a sling as well," she said briskly, not pausing to acknowledge Lord Felix's gratitude. "I suspect you won't need it, but it'll be good to have if you constantly forget and try to use the arm as usual. You're right-handed?" "Yes, my lord," Eiji nodded. "Good. That'll make it easier to leave the left arm alone. I'll leave you some medicine to help with the pain, but I'm giving it to Felix. He is allowed to give you 3 drops in the morning and 3 at night, but no more than that, and you need to stop taking it as soon as you can get through your day well enough without it. It can be addictive." That was a terrifying thought. Eiji hated the idea of losing control of himself and his behavior so much that even back at the temple, where each offering was permitted a single glass of wine on holidays, he'd never tasted it. He wanted to refuse the medicine entirely, but the throbbing in his shoulder was crowding his brain and driving tears to his eyes, and he couldn't bring himself to turn down anything that might help. "We'll be careful." Lord Felix's voice was so level and certain that Eiji's fears quieted, just a little. "Otherwise, my instructions are all quite standard," Lord Julia said. "Keep it elevated, use it sparingly, and keep an eye on the bruise. You'll have to avoid prostrating yourself for a few days at least, so you might want to wear the sling when you're out in the hallways, even if you don't need it. Most of us aren't overly prickly about protocol, but if someone gets their knickers in a twist, you can point out that you're injured and I told you to stay on your feet." "Yes, my lord." Eiji didn't care for that instruction. He might not be the best anymore, but at least he'd always been able to take pride in his ability to move gracefully and behave appropriately. Still, the loss of his few skills was no more than he deserved for his stupidity in leaving the damn chest out unsecured. Lord Julia wrapped the wounded shoulder, gave him 3 bitter drops of medicine mixed in a cup of water, after rattling off a truly terrifying list of possible side effects to watch out for, and handed Lord Felix several neatly rolled bandages, a sling, and a tiny bottle. Even once she finally left, Eiji kept his gaze on his lap. For once, it wasn't just manners that kept him from meeting his master's eyes. "I'm sorry for her sense of humor," the god said after a moment. "She shouldn't have joked about me beating you. I hope you know I would never do that." "Judging by the sling and the bandages, I seem to be quite capable of beating myself." Sleep-deprived and still drunk on pain, Eiji couldn't keep himself from smiling at the thought. "What is it?" Lord Felix asked anxiously, coming to kneel down in front of Eiji again. His big, dark, worried eyes coaxed the truth right to Eiji's lips, as always. "Forgive me, my lord. I just..." gesturing helplessly to his shoulder. "Don't appear to need anybody's help in that regard." Felix's laugh sounded more startled than amused, but it shook something loose in Eiji, and he laughed too. As soon as he did, he clapped his hand over his mouth, his right hand luckily, though that elbow was still sore. He rushed to his face. He'd always been embarrassed by his laugh. The priest had taught him a light, melodious chuckle that he used freely, but his real laugh was piercing and wheezing and not at all fit for the ears of a god. He lowered his hand to apologize, but Lord Felix interrupted him. "You have such a beautiful laugh," the god whispered, gazing up at Eiji with a smile that he would have called dazed and foolish on the face of a human. "I'd never heard it before. I'll have to try to be more amusing." Now Eiji wanted to cover his whole face instead of just his mouth. "My lord does his unworthy servant too much honor." Lord Felix sighed and crawled back a little before standing. Was he worried about crowding Eiji or looming over him at too close a range? Ever since Norio pointed out how careful the god was about his movements, Eiji had been noticing it himself. "Do you think you'll be able to go back to sleep?" Lord Felix asked. "It's still a few hours until dawn." Could he? Eiji was exhausted, but also totally alert. His mind practically whirred over everything that had happened, everything that was going to happen because of it, and everything he had learned about his master and Hiroya. He knew if he tried to lie down in the dark and fall asleep, his mind would devour itself. "I don't believe so, my lord," he said. "All right, then." Lord Felix took a deep breath and seemed to gather himself. "I would like you to come out to our sitting room with me." "Yes, my lord." Eiji felt a great rush of gratitude as his body relaxed into the safety and certainty of having his orders. The god seemed much less relaxed, words torrenting out of him as if he couldn't stop them. "Unless you need some time to yourself, of course. Julia and I have been all over you for the last hour, and it would be understandable if you did." "Not at all, my lord." Eiji lowered his gaze, and then, wondering if boldness had been one of the side effects of Lord Julia's medicine, he blurted, "It would be a true pleasure to attend my lord. I would be grateful for my lord's presence." He flushed at his own daring, but Lord Felix beamed down at him so happily that it was hard to feel any regret. Instead, he offered a cautious smile of his own in return. "Wonderful," the god said. "Do you need any help getting up?" Once Eiji was settled in one of the soft chairs, his master sat opposite him. "Do you think you'll be able to work this next week?" he asked. "I could speak with Zenji if you need some time off." "I'm not sure, my lord." Eiji worked the shoulder and bit back a curse. He doubted he'd be able to push his cart for a few days at least, but even so, the thought of losing his work sent panic clawing up his spine. Rokuro was beginning to trust him with more interesting work. Zenji had praised him to Lord Felix. Norio had incurred punishment by eavesdropping on his behalf. How could he let them all down? And what if after a few days they no longer welcomed him back? Would he lose all these fragile new bonds? Eiji wasn't really sure how these things worked. He'd never had many friends. He and his cadre had all grown up together, of course, playing indiscriminately, but by the time he was 5 or 6, he was already focused on beating the effortlessly perfect Akito for top spot in all their classes. That hadn't left much time for playing or gossiping with the others. He wondered now whether that had been the right choice. He would never have been so determined to push Akito down to second place if he had known what that would mean for the graceful, vibrant boy. He remembered Akito as a smiling flower of the temple, always surrounded by friends and admirers. Eiji had hated him for how easily everything came to him. Eiji would practice a dance step until his feet were blistered and swollen just to keep up with Akito, who would invariably pick it up on his first try. Eiji would study night after night, fretting over the possibility of developing dark circles under his eyes and reducing his standing still further, while Akito had a magical-seeming ability to recall every word of a hymn or history after reading it only once. Eiji used to glance up from his books to glower at Akito, where he lounged and laughed in the sun with his friends, caught between envy and self-loathing as he glimpsed what his life could have been if he had been a natural attendant instead of a fraud. He had lived in fear that at any time, Akito would choose to exert himself just a little bit and effortlessly reclaim the top spot that Eiji had fought and clawed to wrest away from his unresisting fingers. It had never happened. Akito had been perfectly content with second place. After all, the second best offering always went to Lord Marcus, and was personal service to one god really all that different from another? Eiji remembered the way Akito had been at the end. It had been about 2 years ago now that Lord Marcus had finally killed him, and by then the news had almost come as a relief. Akito had barely come to their exercise sessions anymore, and when he did, he rarely spoke to anybody. He had been pale and bruised all the time, almost too weak for even the gentlest exertion. His eyes had turned hollow and haunted. When Eiji had heard Lord Antony berating Lord Marcus for his carelessness in snapping Akito's neck during a feeding, he had just been grateful that the other man's end had been quick. "I did that." Eiji had known it the whole time, but for some reason it hit him in a new way as he sat in Lord Felix's cozy chair under his master's warm, concerned gaze. If he hadn't pushed, if he hadn't had that horrible selfish drive to be the best, then Akito would have gone to Lord Antony and probably fared much better than he had. Akito would have been claimed by Lord Felix at the end of the cycle, and he would have known how to repay the god's kindness and affections as he deserved. Most importantly, he would still be alive. Eji's vanity had killed a sweet, gentle man who had never done him any harm, and what good had it done? He had crushed Akito underfoot in his quest to be Lord Antony's chosen, and then he had failed abjectly in that role. Nobody had received the slightest benefit from all his relentless striving. Not the gods, not Akito, not even himself. Eiji had pushed and pushed until the world had been remade, the proper order of things disrupted. If he ever stopped pushing, it would all be over. If he didn't go back to work after the rest day, all his tender, tenuous new ties would crumble away to nothing, because they would see that he was an imposter and a murderer who didn't deserve any of the good things this week had brought him. Zenji's praise, Norio's consideration, and all of Lord Felix's gentle touches and sweet words belonged rightfully to Akito, just like the top spot had. And like the top spot, he couldn't keep hold of them if he didn't work for them every single day. "I hope they will let me do something," he said, horrified to hear his voice wobble dangerously. "I'm sure Zenji will find something," Lord Felix said. Eiji would have expected him to respond to his tearfulness with soothing tones, but instead he just sounded confident, as if there was no question what Zenji would do. It was far more comforting than excessive tenderness would have been. "There's always 100 things to do in that place," the god went on. "Even if he just puts you in charge of watching Norio and making sure he behaves, that would be one less task." Eiji let out a fragile laugh at that, astonished that he could laugh at all when his heart was still so choked with fear and regret. Lord Felix grinned. "I knew I could be amusing and win more of your lovely laughs if I put my mind to it." His master was so proud he was preening, and it was so ridiculous for a mighty war god to be smug over his ability to make Eiji laugh that Eiji couldn't help laughing more. Closing his eyes against the onslaught of laughter, he leaned his head back to rest on the soft chair. His shoulder was feeling much better, he reflected hazily. When his laughter died away, he couldn't quite bring himself to open his eyes again, and before he even had time to realize that it was going to happen, he fell asleep.